Candace Keller is an associate professor of African art history and visual culture here at MSU. She earned an MA and PhD from the Department of History of Art at Indiana University, where she majored in African art, including contemporary African art and photography, and minored in African studies and African American art. Her research focuses on the history of photography in Africa, particularly Mali, with an emphasis on local theoretical perspectives and aesthetics. Along with her passion for teaching and learning, two fundamental forces drive Candace's instructional pursuits: the desire to promote respect for intellectual and cultural diversity and variant life views, and the will to bring the rich complexities of African art, culture, and theoretical ideas to Western audiences. Her research and courses center on issues of identity, personhood and complex agency, globalization and the flow of material culture, nationalism and post-colonialism, and the power of art and aesthetics in international contexts. Today she'll be discussing her NEH-funded digital project, also funded by the British Library, Archive of Malian Photography. So, Candace?
So I realize there are two microphones here. I don't know if it matters how close to each other they are. Okay. Let's make sure I get them both on correctly. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, good morning, and I'd like to thank Sean for inviting me to participate in this symposium and to talk about this project, the Archive of Malian Photography, for which I am the director. It's been funded by the British Library Endangered Archives Program and the National Endowment for the Humanities Preservation and Access Division. And for this project, I've been working with Matrix, the Center for Digital Humanities and Social Sciences at MSU. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a background on how this project came about, and an overview about the project, and then raising some of the ethical issues that we've addressed or are trying to address through the process. So this project derived from my history, my research on the history of photographic practice in Mali from the 1880s to the present, but really focusing on African photography, photography produced by Africans for African audiences in Mali, West Africa, since the 1940s. So as you see before you, portraiture, but many of these photographers also worked for the police, for the colonial and national governments, taking documentary photographs or reportage, which are photos, sometimes portraiture outside of the studio in various celebratory contexts, photographs of school children for class photos, advertisements, so a variety of photos, which is important for why we're doing this project. So I started this project, my research, I guess I should say, in 2002. And when I began in Bamako, the capital of Mali, I wanted to start working with the oldest photographers, because by the time I arrived, many had passed away, and so that's a wealth of knowledge that goes with them. So I wanted to try and work with them first. The photographer that I've worked most closely with has been Malik CDB, who's based in Bamako. You may be familiar with his name. He's the first African photographer to win the Hasselblad International Award in Photography in 2003. He's also the first African photographer to win the Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale for Lifetime Achievement Award, and since that time, he's won several international accolades, including the Infinity Awards in New York in 2008 and Photo España's Baum and Mercier Award in 2009. So I'll just go back a second to show you that. So I started in Bamako, and then I followed the photographers' networks, their apprenticeship systems, the ways in which they worked over the years, and it brought me to Ségou, up the river to Mopti, to Timbuktu, to Gao, back down the river to cities that aren't pictured on that map, Sikasso and Buguni in the south. So over the course of my research for almost 15 years, I've worked with maybe 150 photographers in their studios, following them on their reportage contexts. And in the process, I learned that a primary concern for the photographers or the custodians of their archives, in the case that the photographer is now deceased, is the preservation and maintenance of the archives themselves, because the physical way in which they've been maintained all these years is not acid-free, archival safe, not climatized environment. So they are vulnerable to climactic challenges, extreme temperatures, dust, abrasion. You can see that here's Abderrahmane Sakali's collection. It's housed in many cardboard boxes. Oftentimes the negatives themselves are housed in postal envelopes, not archival free, so they've adhered to one another. We've lost many to flooding and a variety of other issues. So the physical preservation was one primary concern. And so here you can see Mamadou Cissé's archives and how many are just stacked and stained and in bad shape. So we've lost many already. And then in the 1990s, commercial photography, particularly portraiture, from West Africa, not just Mali, but two of the most famous, arguably, photographers in the international market, Seydou Keita and Malik CD Bay, are Malian. This photography became very popular in the international art market as a form of fine art. And with that brought a lot of collectors, curators, dealers to the continent, particularly to West Africa and to Mali, in my case, after several exhibitions. And so people were interested in finding these archives that had not yet entered the canon, and volunteered to have exhibitions of these photographers' works abroad, usually so far in France, the Netherlands, and well, pretty much France and the Netherlands. And they would say, well, you don't have the capacity to print large scale here in Bamako in Mali, so we're going to need to borrow the negatives, bring them to Lyon, Honfleur, Paris, wherever, Denmark, and we'll have an exhibition. We'll invite you. You'll get the negatives returned at that time. And of course, they do have the exhibitions. They do print the negatives, but they never invite the families to participate, and they never return the negatives. So there are many lawsuits currently in play by many of the families of the photographers or the photographers themselves that I'm going to show you today, as trying to reclaim these images. So one case that I'm showing you is a website called the Sokoland African Collection, which is a Danish man who in the 1990s was working with a graduate student and said that he was interested in a preservation project, working with these negatives. And so, for example, Abderrahmane Sakali, you see his collection and his bio in front of you. He borrowed these negatives and has retained them and refuses to return them, and he still has this website offering exhibitions that you can purchase from him. You can purchase photographs. He's had two exhibitions I highlight here in yellow, 2006 and 2007, since he was arrested in Bamako in 2005 for not returning these negatives because the family has a lawsuit against him there. That was during the Rencontre de la Photographie, which is a biennial of photography that's taken place in the capital Bamako since 1994. And I was there in 2005, and before he was arrested, I confronted this person and I asked him, why is it that you refuse to return these negatives that you wrongfully retain? And he said, well, I have to eat too. So that was his take on it. So after being arrested, released on bail, he left the next day. And you can see that he's since had exhibitions without permission and continues to offer these images and to rent exhibitions online illegally. And there's also a case of a graduate student. I should say there are many cases such as this. I'm just showing you two. And some cases include people in Mali, people who hold high positions in institutions that are cultural or art-related institutions. And so there's a lot of mistrust locally as well, which is going to factor into this project as I explain it. And then also there's clear mistrust about foreign dealers, curators, and even scholars. So this is a case where a graduate student from France said again that he was interested in having an exhibition in Lyon and Honfleur. And these are Tidjani Chitou's photographs. And so he had those exhibitions, did not invite the family. He was working with the photographer's son. The photographer is deceased. His son, Ibrahim Chitou, lent him these negatives. They appeared on the cover of African Arts, which I saw and thought, this is curious, and contacted the family, and they said, yes, we did not give permission for that. So subsequently, there were incensed emails and phone conversations to which I was privy. Finally, the negatives were returned and there was some money exchanged, but it was a big challenge. To this day, he still has blog sites, and on Facebook, he has these images up and offers, again, he's printed calendars, all sorts of things for sale without permission. So the primary issues that this project is trying to address in terms of the preservation and access to these archives, which are private archives, is the preservation of the physical negatives, maintaining those in Mali, not removing them from Mali, and protecting them from this kind of exploitation. And then at the same time, creating a digital database and a website so that these archives are accessible for education and scholarship. But these are low resolution images, JPEGs, that can't as easily be exploited as a TIFF, for example. So anyway, these are the kind of tensions that we're trying to balance, the tension between accessibility and open source Creative Commons licensing, and at the same time protecting these private archives from this kind of exploitation, which was the impetus for the project in the beginning. So thus we have the Archive of Malian Photography, and I'm showing you a brochure that we created, which I have here today if any of you are interested. And then on the right is the website that we're building, which is scheduled to be launched at the end of the month. I just have placeholder text there to give you an idea of what the front page and what it will do, but I'll walk you through it later. So this project has been funded in 2 phases. The first was the British Library Endangered Archives Program, which was a challenge because the agents who fund this grant stipulate that it needs to be pre-modern, even though they include photography as something that could be funded. And so it's a little bit of a challenge to argue for how photography is pre-modern, which by definition, it's a modern technology. So we did that successfully after a few tries. And the way that we were able to argue it is that they were interested in the content. They wanted content that showed life in Mali, sort of rural, traditional cultural practices, and then also the transition from a colonial to a national government. So we worked with Malik CDB's photographs. He was a photographer who began in 1948, and he worked both for the colonial government and for the national government. He was in the French army, the Tirailleurs Sénégalais, in 1952, and he took photographs in that context. Later, he worked for the national press and the colonial press before that, and operated studios in Mopti, Ségou, and Bamako until 1986. And so his work is very early among photographic collections that exist, and he captures a lot of this that the British Library was interested in. Then we worked with Abdraman Sakali, who is actually Senegalese. He came to Mali in 1946, and he started practicing photography in the early 1950s, but he's probably the most locally famous photographer who has worked in Bamako since the 1950s through the 70s. And so, again, his images capture life from the colonial to post-colonial urban world, so they were interested in these. Now, I should say the stipulations for this project, because they needed to be the oldest, meant that we started from the oldest photos in the collection, or the oldest negatives, and we would just work straight through. There was no selection process other than that. We weren't able to pick, we just had to go in order, which means there's a lot of redundancy, and you could only cover 3 years because there's so many negatives. But to show you some photos of Mamadou Cissé, so you can see the Hunters Festival, some dignitaries, political dignitaries. He captured the coup in 1968, for example, and then imams, grand imams, and other leaders of the Muslim faith locally, as well as studio photography, portraiture, and what's called reportage, which tends to be these party photos of young people. And Abdurrahman Sakali, again, took photos of the elite in Bamako, whether they're Malian or French, and so very popular, well-known, huge archive, hundreds of thousands of negatives. So there you can see how we organized his hundreds of thousands of negatives from those original cardboard boxes that you saw earlier, and arranged them according to date in the boxes that he had maintained, which are old paper boxes, so they are archival safe. And then we were only able to get through, 10 of those boxes for this project. So we processed 28,000 negatives from the archives of both Mamadou Cissé and Abdurrahman Sakali, and on the right you can see that now they are in archival safe envelopes and boxes. And then the second phase of the project, funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities Preservation and Access Division, which will go through 2017. So we're in our second year. We're processing about 100,000 negatives from the archives of 4 photographers. Year 1 processed Abdurrahman Sakali's archives again, because there are so many, and Malik CDB, that photographer that I told you is the most acclaimed internationally. So we worked with his. So here are some photos of Malik CDB, since I already showed you some of Abdurrahman Sakali. Again, well known for portraiture locally and internationally, as well as reportage, or those party photos of youths. More recently, he's started sort of innovative photography in the international art world, where he has started a vue de dos series, which is these back views that he's created, which we could talk about later if you're interested in that. And then he's started working with designers and fashion magazines on commissions for fashion shoots. And so he did one, for example, in 2009 for the New York Times Magazine, and I wrote an article on that, which I also brought with me if any of you are interested in learning more about this. And then now we're in year 2. So we're working with Adama Kouyate's photos and Tijani Shitu. And Adama Kouyate began also in the 1940s in Ségou, but he's an interesting case because he left the country pretty early. He did not like the socialist government of Modibo Keïta in the 1960s, so he got out, he left and went to the Hovoto, or current day Burkina Faso. And he opened a studio there, and then when they had a coup in 1966, he moved down to the Ivory Coast in Bouaké and opened a studio until Mali's coup in 1968, where Modibo Keïta was overthrown, and he returned back to Mali in 1969 and opened a studio in Ségou, where he has remained. And he is the earliest photographer in Ségou. He's trained all the photographers who work there today, and he's still practicing. And so his collection is interesting because it tells more of a story beyond Mali of West African photography and culture and relationships and trends between these places. He's most known for these photographs of infants. If you see on the right, any photographer in the world will tell you it's difficult to photograph an infant in particular. And so he developed a way where the mother is present, but she's covered with cloth, so you can't see her. And so it keeps the baby still. And so he's famous in Mali for this, and he's been quite successful over the course of his career. And then Tijani Shitu is another interesting case because oftentimes in scholarship, when we're talking about art in African contexts, the focus is either ethnic or cultural based, or national based, so Malian photography or Bamana photography. But he's actually Yoruba from Nigeria, but he learned photography in Mali from Bamana culture group working practitioners. And he traveled down the river and ended up working with Malik CD Bay, and Malik CD Bay gave him a lot of equipment and suggested that he move up to Mopti, where there really wasn't a market yet. Well, there was a market, but there wasn't a photographer to suit the market, and so he went up there in the 1970s, and he's quite famous there as well and responsible for training a lot of the young people. And here you can see different examples of his portrait photography. Okay, so for the second phase of the project, we were able to have more of a say in the criteria, the selection of what images were being processed. And it was important to the photographers or their families, the custodians of these archives, and also to us, because we can't process everything, unfortunately. We wish that we could. So we wanted to focus on photographers who are both locally and internationally significant. They cover 3 major sites of photographic production in Mali: Bamako, the capital, and then smaller cities, Séguin and Mopti, spanning 3 generations of photography, the 1940s really, all the way to the 1990s, but photography sort of took off in the 1950s. They're emblematic of their eras. They capture cultural practices, social trends, political realities of these time periods, and as well as the specific artistic innovations and styles of the photographers themselves. And we sampled across career. So let's say if it was a 20-year career like Tijani Shitu's, then we would take 1,000 per year approximately. And it was his earliest assistant who did the choosing, because he's most knowledgeable and close to the collection of the people who are living. He's unfortunately deceased. We cover medium format, which is what was included in the earliest examples for the British Library, but also 35 millimeter, which became more viable in Mali in the late 1970s and 1980s. So both black and white and color are included. We're most interested in the historical significance as well as the artistic merit of the image, and best in kind. So we didn't want redundancies like we had in the British Library. In this case, we wanted to find the best in kind because we're basically representing their career. So here's an example of a photography student, up and coming. He's already exhibited in the Bamako Biennale, the photography Biennale last year, and he's had a residency in France. He's now applied to the Studio Museum in Harlem for another residency, so he's kind of an up-and-coming young artist, but he's also working on this project with us because he's currently a graduate student at the Center for Photographic Training, so we incorporated student work in this for sustainability purposes and development. So he's working on Malik CD Bay's selection processes. You can see quite laborious with a light table there, choosing images. So the primary goals of this project are, of course, the preservation and sustainability of the archives themselves, the physical archives. So we have a headquarters in Mali, which means that all of the archives are there, and the people who are working on them there, and they're doing it collaboratively, so they're helping each other out. We have held 3 trainings, workshops over the course of these projects, and we've made videos, and they're using that locally. Beyond this project, there are other people, including Mr. Kalapo, the young student I just mentioned. He's doing his own preservation project now too, and there's a lot of people who are interested in this. So slowly, the training is trickling out into other groups, and even BC Silva, who was the artistic director of the Biennale this past year for the 10th anniversary. She's the director of the Contemporary Arts Center in Lagos, Nigeria. And so she sent several people to work with this team who are interested in, let's say, Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria for conducting these kinds of projects. And so they've been training them, showing them the kinds of things that we're doing. But anyway, this is part of our team working at the office of Yusuf Sakali. He is the man kind of right in the middle looking at the computer. He's the oldest son of Abdurrahman Sakali. He's the one who's the custodian of Abdurrahman Sakali's archives. He's responsible for them, but he's also quite successful. He runs an IT business in Bamako, and so he's dedicated a room in his office space for this project, and so that's sort of the headquarters. And because of his position as the son of a photographer who's also part of this project, there's a lot of trust in him as being the project manager in Bamako currently. So just some examples of the working space. That's Malik CDB's son, Kareem CDB, who's working on the project, and Masaran Jankumba, who's another student at the Center for Photographic Training, who's working on this project with us. So in addition to that, the intellectual property and cultural heritage need to be protected. And so we are scanning, so in addition to cleaning, rehousing, cataloging, because these collections aren't cataloged, and digitizing them, we're making high resolution TIFFs that remain with the private archives, but they also are with the Matrix database, and they'll be maintained in perpetuity in cold storage as technology changes. There's a promise to keep that going. And then low resolution 72 DPI JPEGs at 600 by 600 are going online. And then they're also at the Maison Africaine de la Photographie, which is a center in Bamako dedicated to photography. It's a sort of a museum. It's a school. Well, the hopes are that it will become a school. It's an archive, and it's an exhibition space, a gallery. And so they are the only place that all these photographers or custodians of these archives felt they could trust any parts to include locally. So they won't let the TIFFs go, but they are willing to donate a JPEG study collection and a computer to sit at the Maison Africaine de la Photographie so that students and other researchers and people in Mali can have access to this if they don't have access to the internet. And then, of course, international accessibility for free was an important part of this, both for the families and the photographers in Mali. They want this work and this history to be part of an international understanding of photographic practice, but they don't want it exploited. So they are interested also in making these things accessible worldwide. And so we're developing the website, as I mentioned before, and there's the URL, and I'll show you some pictures from it later. Again, it should be live at the end of the month, but here's the landing page. You know, it will have kind of an overview written by me about photographic practice in Mali historically, a bio page for each of the photographers, their portfolios. You'll be able to browse or search the collection using specific keywords in terms of the browse that I anticipate people from different fields might be looking at when they're studying these images, might find interesting. And then a bit about the project, how it was funded, the choices we made, the ethical choices that we made, and how we're trying to balance open access, Creative Commons, with the protection of these materials, particularly the images from exploitation. Another part of this project is capacity building and sustainability, as I mentioned. So that's why we're working with photographers, older photographers who were the assistants or the sons of these photographers, so training them in preservation processes, working with a conservationist or a conservator, photo conservator in San Francisco, Haida Shoemaker. She's held several training sessions with them, so how to maintain your collections in perpetuity. For example, someone like Musa Kalapo, who's a young and upcoming artist, he's going to want to know how to preserve his work in the same climactic conditions in Mali. And then other students who are studying photography at the Center for Photographic Training. So right now that's Musa Kalapo and Mansaran Jakumba, teaching them how to work in Photoshop, digitization processes, best practices with metadata, cataloging using Excel, rehousing, all of these things. And then in addition, we're working with English majors, graduate students at the École Normale Supérieure in Bamako who are hoping to become English professors. And so it's a dual language database, so it's Francophone and Anglophone, and the original cataloging is done by the people who know the collection the best in French. And then these students translate the French into English. And so it's good practice for them, and they're also learning a bit about photographic practice in their own country through this process. So it's just some contextualizing examples. You can see it goes from this to this at the end of the project. And then we're also doing capacity building with MSU students. So we've worked with 15 students here at MSU so far, both French majors who are editing the French and the English in the metadata to make sure that it reads correctly in both languages and is accurate, and then photo students who are editing not the TIFFs, we're not touching the TIFFs, but the JPEGs for the website, because a raw scan does not accurately reflect the aesthetic expectations of Malian audiences or the photographers who would have printed these in a darkroom at one time. So we're trying to most closely replicate that online so that if people are studying it, they are at least studying it close to as it would have looked originally. Bless you. And there's over 30 people who are working on this project, and this is just a picture of the team that was there for training in 2014. And who's missing, maybe the most important person who's missing is Catherine Foley, who works at Matrix here at MSU. She's the project manager here at MSU, and she's as important to this project as everyone who's pictured there. Just to show you where some of this has gone already, the 10th anniversary of the photography biennial in Bamako took place last November, and so we were asked to do an exhibition on some of the works that we've processed so far, and so the team in Mali put together an exhibition as part of that biennial, and then Yusuf presented on the project to a group of people who are journalists, photographers, scholars, and also people who are interested in doing this kind of archival work with photography in Africa, and we're curious about our processes and how we're doing things. So some photos showing that process. And then, so overall it'll be over 100,000 negatives from the archives of 5 photographers, and you'll be able to search just looking at images with some description about them, where they're located now, identifiers, but there's a lot more metadata than that in the database. And then you can just search through, images if you're just wanting to look by photographer or date. Again, a little bit about the background of the project, about the history of photography in Mali. Oh, that's something different. So I figured I would just open it up at this point, now that you know a little bit about the project, for if you have any questions about what it is that we're doing. We have plans to apply for to the British Library Endangered Archives program grants. One, to continue Mamadi Cissé's work, because more was found in a trunk by the family than was identified when we worked on this project. And then another project with the National Press Archives that go back to 1959 when it was a colonial press. They are not cataloged or well maintained either, and there's a lot of important history there, and a lot of important photographers worked for the press, and it's not labeled whose work it is, and the sort of last 2 older men who could identify who most of the photographs are taken by are in their 80s, so there's kind of a sense of urgency to do something about that. And then we want to continue with the NEH project, because ideally we'd like this to broaden beyond Mali and become something that's encompassing more of West Africa, to give a better sense of the relationships between these photographers, but also people and trends and cultures and all those sorts of things.